The boys gazed at her as though they had never seen her before. Her mother glanced at her and felt a sharp dismay. This Nicholas was all that Miranda had said, and more. She had never seen a man so handsome, nor one who seemed more masterful. There had been tenderness and proper homage in his greeting of Miranda. You couldn't ask more of a husband than that he should be masterful and tender, especially when wealth and position went with it. "What's the matter with me, then?" thought Abigail. She opened the oven door and turned the loaves. Come what might, the baking had to be done. The bread was doing well. She shut the oven and, seizing a knife, began to pare apples with vicious jabs. After the second apple, she laid the knife aside. Might as well face it. From the instant that he had walked through the door into their house, Abigail had felt a queer revulsion. Not quite fear, but akin to fear. No reason for it, she told herself, but the feeling of recoil and apprehension remained. "Get to your chores, boys," she addressed her sons briskly. "This matter doesn't concern you." They rose, pausing as they heard their father's voice raised in angry protest, and the calm, slow tones which answered. Reluctantly they filed out, Tom to the evening milking, Seth and Nat to the woodpile. On the way they covertly examined the shining carriage, the sleek, beautifully matched horses, and the coachman, who entirely ignored the boys. In the kitchen, the two women drew closer. Miranda took her mother's hand and held it tight. A shiver ran through the girl's body as the parlor door burst open and Ephraim shouted, "Miranda, come here!" Nicholas stood at the fireplace. He wore his usual air of detachment. But Ephraim sat in his armchair, his fingers beating a tattoo on the table, and Miranda saw that his empurpled face showed not only anger but perplexity. "He says he wants to marry you," said Ephraim to his daughter, in a tone of grim disbelief. He drew his bushy brows together. "Says you know all about it." She hesitated a second, then she nodded. "Yes, Pa, I'm going to marry Nicholas." She walked to the fireplace and smiled timidly up at her lover. His eyes kept their expression of controlled annoyance, for he found this scene with Ephraim tedious and unnecessary, but he put his arm around the slender waist and drew the girl to him. Ephraim stared at them both, and suddenly his daughter became to him a stranger. He hunted for words with which to confute these two, to forbid the marriage, to order Van Ryn from the house. But he could not find the words. There were no valid objections, as Nicholas himself had contemptuously pointed out. "What do ye think about this strange business, Abby?" Ephraim turned to his wife, who had followed Miranda into the room. She, too, looked at the couple by the fireplace. Already she's gone from us, Abigail thought with pain, for the girl's face reflected some of Nicholas's remoteness and condescension. It seemed to the mother as though a black chasm had opened across the oak planks in the flooring, and the two of them stood alone upon the farther side. She put her hand on her husband's shoulder. "I think it is to be, Ephraim, and we must make the best of it," she said quietly. Ephraim made a few more protests, but he was helpless against Nicholas's implacable purpose and Miranda's feverish desire. He was outraged to discover that the marriage arrangements had already been made. Nicholas had called at the parsonage, and had engaged the Reverend Clark for 3 o'clock on the next day but one, engaged him to come to the Wells farm. "It's indecent, it's too soon," roared Ephraim, "and my girl must be married in church like a good Christian. I'll have no hole-and-corner wedding here." "Our marriage shall not be solemnized before a lot of gaping strangers," returned Nicholas. He considered that he had already made sufficient concession in securing the Wells' own pastor rather than importing a Dutch dominie, who would have been more suitable to a Van Ryn wedding. "As for the day," he continued, "I can see no reason whatever for waiting." "But she has nothing ready," put in Abigail, "no wedding gown." "She needs nothing. There's an entire wardrobe awaiting her at my house in New York." Abigail's mouth tightened. She looked at Miranda, wishing that the girl would stick up for her rights, would insist on every bride's prerogative of naming time and place herself. But the hazel eyes fixed on Nicholas were blind to everyone else. Miranda was therefore married at 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, April the 4th, in the farmhouse parlor, with no witnesses but her family and Obadiah. Tabitha and her young husband huddled together in a corner behind the cherry desk, both bewildered by this extraordinary turn of events. "I don't envy her," thought Tabitha. "She'll be a second wife, and he's so much older." But she looked from Nicholas to Ob's patient, ox-like face, and sighed unconsciously. Outside it was raining hard, not a spring shower, but a steady downpour from which drops spattered against the window panes with tiny hissing sounds. Dankness seeped through the parlor and found its way to Abigail's heart. She closed her eyes to shut out the picture of the minister in his black robe, Nicholas's erect back in dark blue, and Miranda in the green silk dress, very pale, making her responses in a muted, trance-like voice. Green is unlucky for brides, thought Abigail. Not only the green dress, but everything about this marriage was unlucky. She was sure of it, though how or why she knew so surely she could not have told. "Come, perk up, Abby," said Ephraim, joggling her arm. "No use wearing a long face now. The girl's made her bed and must lie in it. No doubt she'll do well enough if she obeys Holy Writ, looks to the ways of her household, and eats not the bread of idleness." Now that the thing was done, he saw no point in further protests and misgivings. Abigail had prepared a wedding supper, but Nicholas would not stay for it. "I wish to leave at once. I want you alone," he said low to Miranda. These were the first words he spoke to her after the ceremony. Nor had he touched her, but all during the hurried farewells his eyes were on her. She clung to Abigail when the moment came, but Nicholas allowed her no time to feel the full sorrow of the parting. "Come, Miranda," he said, and indicated the waiting carriage where beside the open door the coachman stood, his cockaded hat in his hand. "It won't be for long. I'll see you often, often," she cried to the silent family group on the steps. They were now inexpressibly dear, all of them, even Ephraim and Tibby. "Oh, what have I done? Why am I leaving them like this? Oh, Ma, darling!" She stretched her arms out to them in an abandon of longing, but Nicholas lifted her into the carriage. He shut the door, beckoned to the coachman. The horses started forward. A sensation of unreality seized her. She leaned against the blue velvet cushions and closed her eyes. "This is not I," she thought. "It can't be that I'm married. When I open my eyes, I'll be back in the little attic bedroom. Ma is down there in the kitchen setting dough. The baby is crowing in her cradle, waiting for me to pick her up. Pa and the boys are out in the fields." She opened her eyes and saw Nicholas watching her. She raised her left hand, staring in unbelief at the heavy golden band on her finger. "Yes," said Nicholas. "We're married, Miranda." His words increased her panic. "But I don't know you," she thought. "How can I be married to you when I don't know you?" Again she stared at the wedding ring. She saw another hand, a fat one with a gold ring not unlike this on its puffy finger, saw it lying on the black coverlet, clear in the light of 2 tapers. She made a small sound and shrank to the farther side of the seat. Nicholas's eyes narrowed. He put his hand on her shoulder. His fingers closed so that her flesh beneath the green silk was bruised. He pulled her to him and kissed her once. His kiss effaced Johanna as it effaced the memory of Abigail's strained face. She tasted fear, and beneath the fear, a strange and shamed delight. He released her and laughed. "We'll soon be home," he said. "This is no place for love-making." She was hurt by his laugh. It was as though he had triumphed over her, and having seen her submission, had lost interest. At Pelham, he turned to her, saying, "There's a tavern here where we can get some wine and food if you want to, though everything's prepared for us in town." She was chilled and faint, but she saw that he did not want to stop. "No," she murmured, "I'm all right. Let's go on if you want." "Good," he said softly in the darkness. "We shall go on." Go on to what? She thought, and panic broke through. Last night, when she had gone to the little attic room, Abigail had tried to talk to her. "Ranny, I hardly know how to prepare you." Her mother had paused, slow color flushing her thin cheeks. She had turned from Miranda, fixing her unhappy eyes on the room's farthest corner. "You must submit to your husband, even if it... No matter what, you must do as he wishes. You see—" "Yes, Ma, I know," Miranda had interrupted. She, too, was embarrassed, but stronger than that was the feeling of desecration. Even her mother might not touch on any aspect of the miracle that was occurring, the unbelievable joy of her union with Nicholas. And now they were married, and the magic ceremony had not yet transformed them into two different human beings as she had expected. She knew him no better than she had before. "But it will be all right," she told herself. "I'm foolish to feel frightened. All brides feel this way. Even Tabitha did. I know she did." She gave a choked sigh, and Nicholas looked at her. "We're nearly home," he said. "See, these are the lights of Yorkville. Only 3 more miles." On 10th Street, they turned east to Stuyvesant Street, and the horses, knowing their nearness to the stable, broke into a canter. She saw a flash of open iron gates, the curve of a short drive, and the carriage stopped before a large 3-storied brick house with a graceful white portico. Nicholas took her arm and ushered her through the front door into a panelled hall which seemed to her, tired as she was and giddy with excitement and weariness, to be filled by bobbing white-capped heads. "This is your mistress," said Nicholas, thrusting her forward, and a confusion of voices chorused, "Welcome, Mrs. Van Ryn." Startled, she stepped back and looked behind her. Nicholas scowled, his grip tightened on her arm. "Your servants are greeting you," he said. She stiffened, holding her cloak tight around her, forcing to her lips a faint apologetic smile. The aprons and caps, the maroon liveries, filed out. "They're all strangers," she whispered, while underneath her brain repeated dully, "Mrs. Van Ryn. I am Mrs. Van Ryn. Miranda Wells is Mrs. Van Ryn." "Of course," he answered, leading her into a small breakfast room where the table was spread by the fire. "I dismissed all the Dragonwyck servants. Eat now, my dear." He indicated the table. "You must be famished." "All those servants are gone?" she repeated, wondering. "Tompkins, Annette, Magda, all part of the Van Ryn household for years. Thank God they were gone. They would never have accepted or obeyed her. Was that why Nicholas dismissed them? Had he seen how hard it would have been for her? She looked at him gratefully. "And old Zélie?" she asked. "Zélie is dead. When I dismissed the others, she refused to leave. She stayed on alone. The bailiff wrote that she died in the winter." He moved to her side with a quick motion. "Darling, this is our wedding night. Now that we are at last home, shall we not forget everything but us? Here's a glass of wine for you. Drink it." The supper was exquisitely prepared. There was cold capon and jelly, an oyster and mushroom patty, an elaborate frosted wedding cake, topped by a spun sugar wreath of orange blossoms. But though the wine refreshed her a little, Miranda found that she could eat nothing, nor did Nicholas, and seeing that she had not touched her food, he rose. "Come," he said. Color drained from her face, and her throat grew dry as sand. They mounted the stairs through the quiet house. He threw open a door on the landing and led her into the room he had prepared for her. He had had it redecorated in the Empire style. The finest woods, both gilded and inlaid, azure satin draperies embroidered in rose. She saw nothing of this. It was the perfume of 100 flowers that assailed her at the threshold. White roses and lilies, which stood in porcelain vases upon the tables and shone with luminous whiteness in the light of long wax tapers. 2 of these tapers had been placed in golden candlesticks, one on either side of the bed. Her eyes, slowly focused on these, moved to the masses of bridal flowers. "Nicholas, no," she whispered, throwing out her hands with a convulsive and imploring gesture. "Oh, don't you see? The flowers and those candles by the bed. Don't you remember?" She gave a cry as he turned on her, his eyes blazing. She thought he was going to strike her, and she recoiled against the wall. He did not strike her. He walked to the 2 tapers and blew them out. Then he came back to her. "No," she cried, "no, no, please." He picked her up and threw her across the darkened bed. At 5 o'clock, the bells of St. Mark's, half a block away, rang the hour through a cold and misty dawn. A faint light stole between the blue draperies at the window. She had been waiting for this, her aching, tearless eyes fixed on the windows, as they had been for hours. She moved her body cautiously, an inch at a time away from the other who slept beside her. With infinite care, she raised her head, straining through the gloom to discover the things which she must put on. If she could assemble them, there must be some place that she could dress, some way to slip out. Though she had no money, her desperation would persuade someone, a teamster or a peddler, to take her along the road. The light strengthened, and she moved again nearer the edge. She raised herself on one elbow, and on the white skin of her arms and breasts were livid marks. She moved her head farther, calculating how she might slide from the bed in one silent motion, but her long, flowing hair impeded her. She reached back of her head and tried to loosen her hair, but she could not. She dug her fingernails into her palms. Stealthily, as if it moved without her knowledge, her head turned, and she looked down at the figure beside her. Her terror ebbed in diminishing waves, leaving amazement. This was not the same man who had inflicted on her the lurid streaked blackness of those hours just past, who had violated without pity her soul as well as her body. This was not the aristocratic lord of Dragonwyck, nor even the charming and responsive companion she had known once or twice. This was the sleeping face of a young and defenseless man. Almost a boy he looked, with his black hair rumpled as she had never seen it, and the cruel lines about his mouth smoothed away. He sighed a little as she stared down at him, and moved his hand. She saw then that his cheek and his right hand lay on her hair, and her throat tightened, for his unconscious position and movement were unmistakable. It was as though he turned in appeal, blindly seeking comfort in the soft masses of gold that lay outspread on the pillow. His eyes opened and he looked up at her. She braced herself for the change to the expression she knew so well, the cold intensity that held no kindness. But he gazed at her quietly, seeing the sharp inrush of fear in her face. "Miranda," he whispered, with pleading. Still she hesitated, her body curved and poised for flight. His lips twisted into the shadow of a smile tinged with sadness. "You can't leave me," he said. "Don't you know that? Nothing but death will ever separate us." "No," she whispered. "I don't know. I'm afraid." Tears began to roll down her cheeks. He raised his arms and pulled her gently down to him. Her taut body relaxed. This is the way he really is, she thought. I must never forget that no matter what he says or does, he's really good, and he does love me. It was the beginning of a long and painfully maintained self-deception. For the precise type of goodness and love for which her heart yearned had not existed in Nicholas since he was 12, and his mother died. Chapter 13. The first weeks of Miranda's marriage were happy. Nicholas, during that period, was usually the husband she had dreamed of, tender and indulgent. The horror of her wedding night faded, for Nicholas showed her no more violence. She forgot her fears and began to bloom with a softer and maturer loveliness. Her arms, her bosom, and her throat filled out. All sharpness disappeared from her face. Her beauty, no longer ethereal, became seductive, and was enhanced by the magnificent wardrobe which Nicholas provided for her. Some of this wardrobe she found ready waiting in the closets of her dressing-room. It had been made by Madame Duclos from the old measurements. But Nicholas also furnished her with a list of other shops, mantua-makers and milliners, directing her to buy whatever she liked. She spent many hours reveling in the fairy-tale unreality of ordering not one, but 6 leghorn or satin bonnets trimmed with point d'esprit, imported French flowers, or the finest ostrich plumes. In her excitement she bought far more than she could hope to wear, even if she changed her whole costume 5 times a day, and she made some mistakes. She wasn't able to resist a vermilion taffeta dress which darkened her hair and dulled her complexion. But on the whole, her natural clothes sense guided her. Nicholas put no curb on her buying orgy, saying, "I want you to be well dressed, Miranda, as befits your position as my wife. Soon we'll begin to entertain a little, and you must learn to take your proper place in society." This prospect frightened her, for Nicholas expected a great deal. She must be beautiful, cultured, and witty, and she must be a brilliant hostess, so that the Van Ryn reputation for discriminating hospitality might not only be maintained, but acquire added luster. During Johanna's lifetime, this hospitality had been largely Nicholas's concern. The first lady of the manor had had no interest in anyone who did not belong to the River families, and to all other guests had shown a passive indifference. But from Miranda he demanded active cooperation. She must understand current topics, the stormy Oregon question, the annexation of Texas as a slave state, the immediate probability, in view of President Polk's attitude, of a war with Mexico. She must be able to discuss Mr. and Mrs. Keene's Shakespearean productions, the singing of Madame Borghese at Castle Gardens, or Donizetti's new music for Sir Walter Scott's The Bride of Lammermoor. She must be able to express an opinion on the remarkable results of mesmerism. She must, above all, take an intelligent interest in the new books which were appearing from England. Sir Edward Bulwer-Lytton's strange romance Zanoni, a Mr. Thackeray's Notes from Cornhill to Cairo, Mr. Dickens' scandalous treatment of America in Martin Chuzzlewit. Miranda raced through these as Nicholas gave them to her, paying dutiful attention to the passages he marked, for each morning after breakfast they went to the little study off the drawing-room for an hour of concentrated instruction. He was a good teacher, stern over any negligence in her study, but gifted with the ability to make a subject vivid. She slipped easily into the pupil-teacher relationship with him at these times, and was grateful as she began to appreciate the completeness of her former ignorance. A week later, a few select members of New York society received engraved cards bidding them to a soiree and supper at the Nicholas Van Ryn's on Thursday, May the 28th, at 7 o'clock. Miranda's debut was not to be a large affair, and Nicholas had hand-picked the list. Schermerhorns, Brevorts, and the Hamilton Fishes to represent the Knickerbocker aristocracy. Old Philip Hone and his wife, because Mr. Horne, who had once been mayor of New York, was amusing and went everywhere. After some hesitation, all the Astors had been invited. The senile John Jacob, the William B's and their son John Jacob Jr., with his fiancée Miss Gibbs. That the Astors were the richest family in the country influenced Nicholas not at all, and certainly did not outweigh their lowly German background. But he approved the fine new mansion on Lafayette Place, and young John Jacob's cool gravity. Moreover, his fiancée, Charlotte Gibbs, came from an excellent Southern family. Any other host of Nicholas's standing would have stopped there, or rounded out the list with a few more of the elite, the Aspinwalls perhaps, or the Verplanks. But he was indifferent to the high boundaries which separated the sections of New York society, knowing that any gathering was enlivened by a touch of the exotic. Accordingly, he asked Madame Teresa Albanese, who had been singing at Castle Garden, Mrs. Elizabeth Elliot, a sharp-tongued poetess from the Ladies Literati group, and Herman Melville, a young sailor who had just published a book called Typee, which was startling the reading world not only by the originality of its vivid prose, but by its titivating descriptions of naked Polynesian maidens. "By the way," said Nicholas, "the little Count de Grenier is back in New York. He arrived on the Celtic yesterday and sent me a note. I've asked him to the soiree. His wife didn't come with him this time." "Oh?" she said, diverted, remembering the plump Frenchman and his gaiety and compliments at Dragonwyck. How long ago it seemed. The night of the 4th of July ball, the Corrientes waltz with Nicholas. That was when I first knew that I loved him, she thought, and there was pain in the memory. "Nicholas," she said abruptly, "when are we going to Dragonwyck?" Her heart beat fast as she waited for his answer. Yet why should she be frightened of so natural a question? The manor house was his real home, as it was now hers. "Why, it won't be ready until the end of June," he said. "The workmen are there now, painting and making certain changes. I think we'll leave here in a fortnight and go to the mountain house at Catskill to escape the heat before we go to Dragonwyck." She gave a sigh of relief. How silly she'd been, imagining that he avoided not only the mention of Dragonwyck's name, but any thought of living there. She was completely wrong, as she so often seemed to be with Nicholas. "It's like Ma used to say," she thought ruefully, "I've a head stuffed full of silly fancies." She went upstairs to her writing desk and wrote a long, rapturous letter to her mother, detailing her happiness and Nicholas's virtues as a husband. When Abigail received this letter 3 days later and first read it, she was reassured. She passed it on to Ephraim. "Seems contented as a pig in clover. I told you to stop fretting about her," he commented, handing the letter back. But Abigail, again running her eyes over the flowing script, frowned. "I don't know, though. She says almost too much. Seems like she was trying to convince herself as well as me." On the afternoon of the party, Miranda lay in the darkened bedroom and tried to rest. The hairdresser had come and gone, and she dared not move her head for fear of disturbing his handiwork. Everything was ready, thanks to Nicholas and the staff of experienced servants, who neither needed nor welcomed her timid suggestions. They treated her like a charming but useless child, and Miranda overcame annoyance with the realization that she was, in truth, completely inexperienced. It would be fun to meet people, she thought with rising excitement, shutting her eyes determinedly, though sleep was impossible. Except on occasions when she had gone to services at St. Mark's Church around the corner, she had, during these weeks, seen no one but the servants, and of course Nicholas. Not that, she told herself hastily, she wanted anyone but Nicholas. It wasn't that she was lonely, but sometimes she longed for a friend. Another woman with whom she might discuss silly things like clothes or embroidery stitches. With another woman one could laugh and say the first words that popped into one's head, instead of being on guard and anxious. There was a knock on her door, and Mrs. McNabb came in holding a letter. "Just came for you, madam." "From Ma," thought Miranda eagerly. But it wasn't from Abigail. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and the postmark was Hudson, New York. She broke the seal and looked at the signature. Jefferson Turner. How strange that he should write to her. She had seldom thought of him since the week that he had stayed on the farm, and so compelling had been her preoccupation with Nicholas at that time that aside from gratitude for his help in saving Charity, he had made little impression on her except as an instrument for delivering Nicholas's message. "My dear Miranda," said the letter, "I have recently heard of your marriage. I confess it was a great surprise. I hope you'll be very happy. When you come up river, I shall not be here to congratulate you because I've joined the army and leave at once for Mexico. I don't know what sort of soldier I'll make, but I guess they need doctors anyway. Please remember me to your family when you write. I hope all will go well with you. God bless you." It had taken Jeff a long time to write that letter. He never would have written it but for the war and the consequent knowledge that he was very unlikely to return. If a Mexican bullet didn't do the job, yellow fever or dysentery almost certainly would. He had understated the matter when he wrote that Miranda's marriage was a surprise. He had been thunderstruck. Then this emotion had given way to blinding anger, a veritable fury at Nicholas. The fury had been enlightening, and when he calmed down, he faced its origin squarely. Jealousy, and a feeling for Miranda which would not in the least tolerate the thought of her as another man's wife. Ephraim had not been far wrong when he had told Abigail that Jeff would return to Greenwich, for that had been in his mind. All along, Jeff realized now, he had been marking time, waiting for Miranda to recover from her obsession. And yet this feeling had stolen upon him so gradually that he had been unaware of it. "Why, in the name of all that's foolish, do I want that girl?" he asked himself derisively when the news of her marriage shocked him into the knowledge that he did want her, badly. But being Jeff, he wasted no time in moping. He translated his feelings into action. He would have enlisted in any case, not being troubled by any hair-splittings as to President Polk's exact motives. The country was at war, and he was needed. That was enough for Jeff. But a decided unwillingness to see Miranda ensconced at Dragonwyck as Nicholas's wife speeded up his decision. Then he wrote to her. Miranda, knowing nothing of this, was puzzled and touched by his letter. There had been antagonism between them from the first. Even during his stay at the farm she had thought that he disliked her. Now it seemed that he did not. She was still staring at the sheet of paper when Nicholas opened her door and looked in. "You're not resting," he said disapprovingly. He walked over to the bed. "What are you reading?" "A letter from Dr. Turner," she answered. There was a pause. Nicholas stretched out his hand. "Let me see it." She gave it to him, a trifle surprised. He never showed any interest in her letters from home. She watched him while he read, and was puzzled to see tenseness vanish from his face, and in his eyes a fleeting impression of what? Satisfaction? Relief? She couldn't be sure. He handed back the letter. "I find his tone rather familiar. Since when does he know you well enough to invoke the blessings of deity upon you?" "He spent a week with us at the farm last fall, you know," she answered nervously. Nicholas's question had held a frequent note of irony. She wasn't sure whether he was really displeased or not. And if he were displeased at her receiving a letter from another man, why had there been that undoubted flicker of relief? "I didn't know he stayed a week," said Nicholas without particular emphasis. "But he's a pleasant young man, and a patriotic one, I see. No doubt you enjoyed his company." There was no mistaking the sarcastic inflection this time. She turned her head wearily, settling back on the pillow. "No," she said. "I thought only of you." The little Count de Grenier arrived first at the soiree. He had grown stouter during the year he had been back at Lyon directing the silk business, of which certain matters of export had required this new trip to New York. His plum satin suit and embroidered vest fitted him like the casing on a sausage, but his black eyes were as lively and curious as ever. His wax moustaches quivered with the same zest. He had been very much interested by the change in the Van Ryn ménage, and was impatient to see Miranda in her new role. When she came, preceding Nicholas down the stairs, moving with her own peculiar grace and hesitating a minute on the threshold to master her nervousness, his Gallic heart was overcome. "But she's veritably beautiful," he thought, jumping up to kiss her hand. "She's incredibly changed." He saw at once, as no man but a Frenchman would have, that part of that change came from outward adornment. The cleverly cut white satin gown with black Chantilly lace ruffles, the touch of coral salve on the lips, the increased blondness of her hair, which she owed to the hairdresser's chamomile rinse, and then, of course, the Van Ryn diamonds sparkling on her bosom. It was the first time that she had worn any of the jewels which had been presented to her by Nicholas. She had done so tonight only because of his express command. Her resistance had died away when she saw how becoming were the newly cleaned and dazzling diamonds. But the great ruby pendant, the pendant Johanna had worn on the night of the ball, she felt that she could never touch. She had never even lifted it from the jewel case. The change in Miranda was, however, by no means entirely due to clothes or jewels or grooming. The Count examined her admiringly. Her voice had grown richer and lost its provincial tone. She smiled and murmured with surprising poise, "I'm so happy to see you, Count." And her long eyes no longer met his with transparent innocence. The Count continued to enjoy himself. He delighted Mesdames Schermerhorn, Brevoort, and Fish by his gallantry and compliments. He maneuvered over to another group in the adjoining parlor. Here he found the Astor family clustered around old John Jacob, who persisted in going out of an evening, though he invariably fell into a restless doze, his shrunken chin sunk on his chest, so that he presented to the company only a bald scalp, mottled brown with age. Over in the corner, near the rosewood piano, he saw Miranda talking to a big man with an astonishing golden beard, which gave him a Jovian appearance and conflicted with the youthful awkwardness of his gestures. Beside them sat a sharp little woman, like a squirrel, her bright, malicious gaze fixed flatteringly on the bearded man, who seemed embarrassed. He approached Miranda and her two companions. She rose at once and said, "Count, may I present you to Mrs. Elliot? She writes such delightful poems. And this gentleman is Mr. Herman Melville, who has just given us that fascinating book, Typee. The Count de Grenier," she added to the others. "Bravo, ma chère." The Count applauded her inwardly. This graceful introduction, worthy of a duchess, except that duchesses always had bad manners, showed the vast distance she had come from the tongue-tied, nervous girl he remembered. "I have heard of your so exquisite poetry, madame," he said quite untruthfully, bowing to Mrs. Elliot, "and it is a great pleasure to meet two American authors. I have longed for the opportunity." He examined Melville curiously. He had not read Typee, but he had heard of it, chiefly that it was indelicate according to the Anglo-Saxon standards set by the young English queen, and that it was so well written that most of the literary critics doubted that it could really be the work of an uneducated sailor. "You have had an interesting life, monsieur," offered the Count, for the bearded young man seemed disinclined to say anything. "Oh, yes, Count," cried Mrs. Elliot, clasping her hands in pretty pleading. "Mrs. Van Ryn and I are just dying to hear all about Mr. Melville's experience in the Cannibal Islands. Too dreadful." Melville turned his massive head and contemplated Mrs. Elliot with calm, sea-colored eyes. "The Marquesans are not cannibals," he said, "but I wouldn't blame 'em if they ate up the missionaries." Mrs. Elliot gave a piercing scream of laughter. "Oh, my, how very droll you are! Why, I give $5 every Sunday to send to the missionaries who convert the poor naked heathen." "Then you better save your money, ma'am. They're much better off as heathen." He lowered his gaze to Mrs. Elliot's décolleté, which revealed a great deal of craggy bosom. "And they're no more naked than you are," he added with emphasis. "Ah, look who is coming here," cried the Count, tactfully creating a diversion, and recognizing a familiar European figure. "It is La Albanaise herself. Now we shall have a treat." They all turned to see Nicholas greeting a vision in orange satin and rhinestones. The Italian singer radiated good nature and pleasant vitality from her oily black hair to the broad feet on which she wore dirty red slippers. She pumped Nicholas's hand in a cordial grip, seized Miranda's, and pulling the girl toward her, crying, "Ah, che bella la bimba!" implanted a garlic-laden kiss on Miranda's forehead. She waved to the Count, whom she had met in Paris. "So happy to see everyone," she boomed, describing a sweeping gesture. "Now I sing for you." She surged over to the piano, leaving a trail of musk through the rooms. "Who will accompany me?" she cried, drawing a sheaf of music from under her arm. "I shall give myself that pleasure, Signora," said Nicholas, bowing and seating himself on the stool. Mrs. Schermerhorn raised her lorgnette and peered doubtfully at La Albanaise. "An Italian opera singer in the drawing-room? Most startling." In any other house she would have been affronted, but Mr. Van Ryn's reputation for conservatism and savoir-faire was impregnable, and his blood was of the bluest. Before the rich, earthy voice had finished the casta diva from Norma, Mrs. Schermerhorn had relaxed, and was wondering if it would be possible to persuade Madame Albanese to appear at a little soiree next week. Gradually, according to their separate natures, they all succumbed to the spell. The singer had great artistry. Her flexible voice fell pure and true on the exact middle of each note. But far more persuasive than that was the vitality that flowed from her, the unashamed and wooing passion. She gave them Voix che sapete from the Marriage of Figaro, and the mad scene from the new Lucia, and the applause was much louder than the decorous glove spatter expected in a drawing-room. La Albanaise bowed, flashing a toothy, delighted smile. "Never have I sing so good," she announced, beaming. But she knew what none of the audience had enough musical knowledge to guess, and she swept round dramatically, extending her hands to Nicholas. "But it is you who inspire me, signora. You play con fuoco, con amore, maravilloso. Never do I think to find such playing in America." "You do me too much honor, madam," murmured Nicholas, smiling. "Tiens," thought the Count, craning to see his host, who was hidden behind the music rack. "That's true. Who would expect to find so much fire and brilliance in a man like that?" "Now I give you a song in English," announced Madame Albanese proudly, and the Count moved his chair a trifle so that he might see Nicholas. The diva sang Maritana's plaintive ballad, Scenes That Are Brightest, contriving somehow to invest the trite words and simple melody with an indescribable pathos, the tragedy of vain hope, of unfulfilled love. During the singing of this ballad, the Count saw Nicholas turn his head so that his intense blue gaze rested on Miranda's averted face. There was longing in that look, an appeal. But when the girl shifted her position, unconscious of his glance, his eyes fell quickly to the music. So, after all, maybe there's something not right between those two, the Count reflected. Suddenly he was bored with his own speculations and delvings, Zut alors, he said to himself, stretching his plump legs. I make mysteries like an old woman. He wondered how long it would be until supper. He had not long to wait. The recital finished with a gay Italian folk song. Then, amidst the chorus of appreciation, Madame Albanese, bowing and smiling, made her way to Miranda. "I want the WC," she announced with simple Latin realism. "Will you show me the way?" Oh, yes," stammered Miranda, blushing scarlet and hurrying the prima donna from the room. When they got downstairs, the guests were starting toward the dining room. Nicholas came over to her and whispered, "Everyone is delighted with you. The party is going well," so that her new mood was easy to maintain, and she found herself talking and laughing at the supper table, all nervousness forgotten. Nicholas had placed Madame Albanese between the Count and Herman Melville, knowing that the other gentleman might find her a bit overpowering. But Melville did not. He talked with animation, and from time to time his laugh boomed out, whereupon Mrs. Elliot glared at him across the table. She was placated, however, when Nicholas asked her about Edgar Poe, in whom she had a proprietary interest. The lady bridled, shaking her sparse ringlets. "Poor Mr. Poe, such misfortunes! His little wife, dying, I fear, and they've moved miles out in the country to a positive hovel." She lowered her voice to a piercing whisper, which immediately stopped all other conversation at the table. "I feel so sorry for him. His terrible failing, you know, too dreadful. And then this scandal with Mrs. Oh!" she cried with a little scream of confusion. "Everyone is listening." Everyone was, but with a collective start they began politely to talk of other things. None of them, except Nicholas, had much interest in the poet's misfortunes. They had simply been hypnotized by Mrs. Elliot's whisper. Nicholas, however, felt otherwise, and to Miranda's astonishment, for she thought Mrs. Elliot a vulgar and unpleasant woman, he engaged her to drive out to Fordham with them on Monday and introduce them to the Poe household. "But why, Nicholas?" Miranda asked him later, after the guests had gone. "Why are we going to meet the Poes? And don't you think that so much of Mrs. Elliot's company will be tiresome?" "I do," he answered, "but we can hardly appear there without someone to introduce us." "But why go at all?" she persisted. The expedition seemed to her highly unattractive. A hovel in the country, a drunken and some said unbalanced man with a wife who was dying of consumption. Nicholas's mouth set. He disliked being questioned, nor was he accustomed to the slightest opposition to his arrangements. She sat before her dressing-table brushing her hair, which fell like a rich gleaming mantle nearly to the floor. In her cream-lace negligee she looked very fresh and lovely, and she had behaved well tonight, had profited to perfection by his careful coaching. He suppressed the sarcastic and final reply which he had been going to give her. "You wouldn't understand, my dear," he said. She put the brush down, and turning on the satin seat, looked up at him. "Why wouldn't I?" she cried passionately. "Why do you always shut me out? Tell me sometimes what you're thinking and feeling before—" She stopped. She had nearly said, "before it's too late." How had so much emotion been aroused in her by so little? No wonder he stared at her. He was silent for a second. Then he pulled his violet dressing-gown closer around him and sat down in a chair opposite her. "My love," he said, smiling, "I had no idea that my motives in wishing to meet Poe were so important to you. I'll gladly explain them. I admire the man's genius. I sense in his writings a strong kinship with my own mind. They have a macabre quality, a voluptuous flavor of mystery and evil which attracts me strongly. And I am curious to see his present degradation. It interests me." His ironic voice ceased, and she made a hopeless little gesture, while tears came to her eyes. Her mind was closed to the meaning of his words, some of which she did not know, macabre, and voluptuous. She had thought for a moment that he was really going to confide in her, to answer her appeal with frankness at last. It never occurred to her that under the masking lightness of his tone, he had told her the simple truth. And he, seeing this, laughed. "Come, my pretty one, it's very late. Go to bed and don't perplex yourself with matters you don't understand." Chapter 14. Although Miranda did not know it for 3 years, the visit to the strange and unhappy little household at Fordham had far-reaching effects on her life. The Poe cottage was not a hovel, but a small workman's frame house with 2 doors and a porch wreathed in jasmine and honeysuckle. It stood on a slight rise of ground under a shading tulip tree. Bees droned around the honeysuckle, and as the Van Ryn carriage approached, the monastery bells of the nearby College of St. John clanged melodiously on the hot, still air. There was here a paradoxical effect of rustic peace. Paradoxical, because there was no peace within the house, where a dying girl and a half-crazed genius were ministered to by the harassed and kindly mother, Mrs. Clem. She hurried out of the kitchen door to greet Mrs. Elliot, who introduced the Van Ryns. "I'm happy to see you, I'm sure," said Mrs. Clem. "Eddie likes company, and my poor Virginia does too, though this is one of her bad days, poor lamb. Dr. Francis is with her now." She sighed, her plain, middle-aged face puckered with anxiety. She was immaculate in her black dress and white cap with long lappets, but the dress was shiny and frayed, and Miranda noticed with pity that Mrs. Clem's right shoe had split and had been neatly mended with a piece of plaster painted black. Mrs. Clem ushered the visitors through a tiny whitewashed passage onto which opened a cubbyhole of a bedroom. There were but 2 other downstairs rooms, the kitchen and the parlor, both meagerly furnished and small, but all was scrubbed and shining with cleanliness. The checked matting on the sitting-room floor, the whitewashed walls, even the low-raftered ceiling. Virginia lay on a makeshift sofa by the window. Her little wasted body hardly raised the covering quilt. Her face, of an unearthly pearly white, was framed by black hair, glossy and neat from her mother's careful tending. Her eyes, brilliant with fever, were upturned to the elderly physician who sat beside her holding her wrist. As Mrs. Clem motioned the others into the room, Poe rose from the rickety writing table where he had been hunched in apathetic despair. "How short he is," thought Miranda, surprised, for she and Mrs. Clem both topped him by inches, and Nicholas's height completely dwarfed the poet. She had come to judge all masculine appearance by the standard of Nicholas's classically etched features, and though many women found Poe attractive, Miranda did not. His high forehead bulged beneath straggling dark locks and seemed to overwhelm his mouth and chin, so that his sallow face was pear-shaped. His mustache was unkempt. Ill health and misery had lined his skin, which was slack beneath his eyes, grey eyes, which could be magnetically piercing and alert, but were now dulled by a recent dose of laudanum. He looked much older than his 37 years. His greeting of Mrs. Elliot was unenthusiastic, for he knew her to be a malignant gossip. Miranda, seeing his coldness, wished more than ever that they had not intruded themselves on the distressed family, but Poe's dullness lightened and his tone warmed when he turned to the Van Ryns. "It's good of you to make the long drive from the city," he said, bowing to Miranda and shaking Nicholas's hand. "I'm sorry that we are at some disadvantage in welcoming you." He indicated Virginia's couch. "I admire your work immoderately, Mr. Poe," answered Nicholas at his most charming, "and I couldn't leave the city without giving myself the pleasure of meeting you and telling you so." Poe was at all times susceptible to flattery, and he brightened still further at the sincerity in Nicholas's voice. "You've read some of my stuff?" he asked eagerly, adding with bitterness, "The Raven, I suppose. Such fame as I have appears to rest entirely on the plumage of that gloomy bird." "I've read everything you've ever published," replied Nicholas, obeying the other's motion to seat himself on one of the stiff cane chairs, "both fiction and poetry. I find your stories provocative and fascinating, although I confess that I prefer the verse. There, it seems to me, that your genius reaches its highest peak." Poe thought so too, and when he found that Nicholas actually knew most of his poems by heart, and could quote even from the obscurer ones, those which the public had long since forgotten, Tamerlane or The Sleeper, the gratified poet pulled his chair over and conversed animatedly. While the two men talked, and Mrs. Elliot hovered beside them, trying to interject literary appraisals and daintily turned appreciations of her own, Mrs. Clem drew Miranda to the couch, where the doctor had finished his examination. The sick girl looked up at Miranda. "So nice of you to come and see Eddie," she whispered. "How pretty you are," she added, with naive sweetness. Miranda smiled and clasped the transparent little hand. She was touched by the patience and gentleness of the childish face. For though Virginia was actually older than Miranda, neither poverty nor illness had aged her. She was the same docile child who had married her cousin Eddie 10 years ago. "I'm sure you'll be better soon," said Miranda, and knew immediately how hollow was that conventional phrase, for the red spots of the consumptive rushed to Virginia's pale cheeks. A paroxysm of coughing shook the small body, while the handkerchief she pressed to her mouth was flecked with scarlet. "Come away, ma'am," said the doctor brusquely to Miranda. "She mustn't talk just now." He took the girl's arm and propelled her toward the kitchen. "No room to sit in here," the doctor explained in answer to Miranda's look of surprise. "Too many people already." It was true. The sitting-room's 3 chairs were occupied by Mrs. Elliot, Poe, and Nicholas, while on the far side Mrs. Clem bent over her daughter, whose eyelids were drooping with exhaustion. "Well, well," said the old man as they entered the kitchen, and his eyes twinkled. "That poor creature in there's right. You're a well-shaped piece of woman-flesh, my dear. Glad to meet you. My name's Francis, John Wakefield Francis. Expect you've heard of me, hey?" He chucked her under the chin. Miranda drew herself up, but it was impossible to resent Dr. Francis. His bonhomie, his genial appreciation of pretty women, and his vigor were only equaled by his generosity. His professional skill and purse were always at the command of the needy. "I don't think," she began, "I've been in New York such a short time." And yet his name did have a reminiscent ring, though she was positive she hadn't heard it recently. "Sad household here," said the doctor, shaking his gray head. "Sorry for all of 'em, poor worms. Nothing but failure and trouble and sickness. Guess you don't know much about those things, hey?" He peered at her rose moiré dress, her lace-covered bonnet, her pearl earrings and brooch. "No," she answered with a little inward shudder. "I guess I don't." "Never be worth a damn till you do meet with trouble and lick it," said the doctor, suddenly thumping the table with a stubby and not very clean hand. "Can't live soft all the time, or you turn to mush. You don't want to be mush, do you?" "No," she said, laughing. She saw that the doctor thought her to be a pampered society girl, and this delighted her. She had then eliminated all taint of the potato farm, the drudgery of manual labor, and it was Nicholas who had translated her, she thought with gratitude. "I'd sell my soul for a cup of tea," muttered Dr. Francis, seizing a poker and rattling the stove's grate. "Long drive back. Lot of patients to see tonight. Don't suppose you know one end of a tea kettle from the other." She hesitated. A girl brought up as he thought she had been, would never have been able to handle that bulky stove. It would be easy to say no, to settle back with her hands folded and wait for Mrs. Clem to come to the kitchen after finishing with Virginia. But the old man looked tired, and also he reminded her of someone. Somewhere below the surface of her mind there was a quiver of recognition, though as yet it sent up no conscious certainty. But the quiver was pleasant. "Give it to me," she said, and took the poker away from him. She tied a clean cloth around her waist to protect the swelling rose skirts from the stove. In a very short time the kettle was boiling. "You're not as useless as you look, my beauty," said the doctor. "Here's the tea." He pulled a packet from his sagging pocket. "Wouldn't do to use any of their tea, and doubt they have enough for themselves." At the precise moment in which she poured his tea for him, Miranda recovered the buried memory. Last fall, in the farm kitchen at home, she had poured like this for Jeff on the night of his arrival, when he had bored her with talk of cholera. And Doctor? Surely it was Dr. Francis. She sat down on the other chair, startled, not by the coincidence, nor by the fact that despite the difference in age there was some resemblance between the two physicians, but by her own emotion at thinking of Jeff. "Do you know a Dr. Jefferson Turner of Hudson?" she asked eagerly. "To be sure I do," the old man answered. "But how do you? I forgot. You Van Ryns live upriver there. Jeff Turner came to see me last year. I don't know as I ever took to anyone right off as I did to him. He's a splendid boy and a damn good doctor. I offered to set him up in New York, like to have kept him near me, but he's got some bee in his bonnet about caring for the community where he grew up. He don't give a hang for money." "No," she agreed, half impatiently. From the beginning, Jeff's frank contempt for the Dragonwick luxury in which he had revelled had caused friction between them. Dr. Francis pushed his cup back with sudden explosiveness. "This plagued war! Don't suppose you know, Turner's gone down to Mexico. Don't blame him. I'd go myself if they'd have me, but it's a foul waste to let a boy like that get killed." "Oh, I guess he won't get killed," she said, smiling. A gust of anger swept the old man. He glared at her. "What do you know of war, ma'am? Come to that, what do you know of life? You and your kind are wrapped a foot thick in cotton wool. Because your own precious hides are safe, you think there's no such thing as danger, or blood and death. Of course he can get killed, and likely will because he's got guts. He'll not only be out on the battlefield tending to the wounded, but he won't rest until he gets a crack at the enemy himself." He stopped and said in a quieter voice, "What's Jeff Turner to you, ma'am, anyway?" Miranda averted her eyes. She had been staring at the angry old man with startled dismay. "I don't know," she thought, "what Jeff is to me." "A friend," she answered at last. His image rose before her now. The sandy hair, the grey eyes which quickly kindled into humour, the powerful hands that could be so gentle in touching a sick child. And with this image, the feeling of confidence and the unsentimental sympathy which were as much part of him as his body. "Yes, a friend, I think," she repeated slowly. "He made a lot of trouble for my husband on the manor, but he also saved the life of my baby sister." The old doctor snorted. "Both just like him. Well, ma'am, I must be going. Likely you're dying to join that metaphysical, poetical confab that's going on in there." He pointed a stumpy thumb toward the sitting room. "Sorry I bellowed at you. Pretty young things like you aren't really required to face unpleasantness. Might spoil that Dresden china complexion." He pinched her cheek, picked up his pill bag, and went out of the kitchen door. Miranda got up and washed the teacup, put another stick of wood on the fire, and straightened the tidy kitchen. She was anything but anxious to join the confab in the other room. The familiar tasks which she had despised, this homely little room, seemed to her a momentary resting place in which to gather strength before plunging again into the tempest of dark emotions which whirled her around Nicholas. Knowing him, as she was beginning to know some aspects of his nature, it was amazing that he had permitted her to be out of his sight so long. It could only mean that his interview with Poe was proving exceptionally interesting. When she finally opened the low door into the other room, she saw that this must be so. Nicholas motioned her with his eyes to sit down, but paid no further attention to her. The two men had moved their chairs around the table, and in the middle of it stood the brandy bottle, half empty, and 2 glasses. Mrs. Clem had taken Virginia into the bedroom and stayed there with her. Mrs. Elliot, ignored by the two men, had moved to the vacated couch, where she sat fanning herself with irritated little flaps. Miranda quietly sat down on the 3rd chair. Shadows had gathered thick in the corners of the room, but there was still light enough to see the deplorable change in Poe, the constant tremor of his sensitive hands, the twitch which pulled at his slack lips, and the glitter of his staring eyes. Miranda turned her head away in horrified pity. Inexperienced as she was, she knew that this was more than simple drunkenness. The very smallest amount of alcohol acted as a violent poison on the poet's precariously balanced system, disintegrating all control. And Nicholas sat there at his ease, his arms folded, gazing at the spectacle before him with sardonic interest. He had himself taken but a 1/4 glass of the brandy. Poe raised the shaking glass to his mouth. "Fame," he cried thickly. "I said I despised it. 'Twas a lie. I dote on it." He lurched forward. The glass fell from his hand and shattered on the floor. At the crash, Mrs. Clem hurried in. "Oh, Eddie, dear, how could you again, when you promised?" she cried, catching up the bottle. She gave the guests a look of mortified apology. "Don't take it away, Muddy." Poe clutched the substantial arm feverishly. "It's anodyne, the liquid nepenthe. Give it back. Fool woman, give it back. Don't you see that with that golden liquid I become a king, a god? It points me the path to the skies, to the Lethean peace of the skies." "Yes, Eddie, dear," said the old woman, stroking his forehead. "That's from your new poem, isn't it? Why don't you read it to them?" She hid the bottle behind her, pulled out the table drawer, and extracted a quantity of foolscap. "Pray do, sir," said Nicholas, crossing his legs. "We should be greatly honored." The poet scowled, shaking his head from side to side, his hand still clawing at Mrs. Clem's restraining arm. Then from the bedroom came the sound of Virginia's agonized coughing. A spasm of terror passed over Poe's face. His head jerked and was still, but his wild, unfocused gaze gradually sobered. "Read them the poem, Eddie," repeated the motherly voice. Through long experience, Mrs. Clem had discovered this recipe for bringing him to, if he had not already entered that terrifying borderland where no human appeal would reach him for days. She vaguely understood that his unintelligible poems, for she never could make out what they were about, represented an outlet for the misery which tortured him, an outlet like the far more dangerous liquor. She sighed with relief as the clutching hand fell from her arm to the sheets of foolscap on the table. He jerked them toward him. "The skies, they were ashen and sober. The leaves, they were crisped and sere." His voice, at first harsh and incoherent, slowly gained timbre. Soon each syllable was accentuated with delicacy, each word rounded to the fullest melody. From his actor parents he had inherited the talent of communicating emotion to an audience. Mrs. Elliot ceased fanning and leaned forward. They were all hushed, even Nicholas, as the voice throbbed and deepened in the weird, evocative cadences. It was Ulalume that he read to them, the elegy that foreshadowed Virginia's death and the recurring defeat of his own soul. The first stanzas meant nothing to Miranda except for their inescapable music. And now, as the night was senescent, and star-dials pointed to morn, as the star-dials hinted of morn, at the end of our path a liquescent and nebulous lustre was born. But it was in the next stanza that the meaning caught her. It was as though the voice with its interpretation swung wide the iron gate and precipitated her into the mists beyond, the region of sighs. Sadness engulfed her like a shroud, a sadness and an eerie foreboding. For a few seconds she was held by fear like that she had felt in the Red Room, and each word seemed directed at her. But Psyche, uplifting her finger, said, "Sadly this star I mistrust. Her pallor I strangely mistrust. Oh, hasten, oh, let us not linger. Oh, fly, let us fly, for we must." In terror she spoke, letting sink her wings till they trailed in the dust. In agony sobbed, letting sink her plumes till they trailed in the dust. Till they sorrowfully trailed in the dust. Miranda, without conscious will, turned her frightened eyes to her husband. For the space of a heartbeat, that phrase echoed in her own soul. Sadly, this star I mistrust. Well I know, now this dank tarn of Auber, this ghoul-haunted woodland of Eyre. The poem was finished. "Magnificent," said Nicholas heartily, and to Miranda's relief he stood up. "Too utterly divine," observed Mrs. Elliot, also rising. She touched Poe's hand gingerly with her fingertips, murmured that it had been a great pleasure, gave a loud, disapproving sniff directed at the brandy fumes which permeated the room, and scurried out to say goodbye to Virginia. "It's not right yet. There are many changes to make," said Poe dully. All vitality had drained out of him. His speech was sluggish again. He made a couple of futile pencil marks on the manuscript, then his head sank forward onto his outstretched arms. His breathing grew stertorous. "Poor Eddie," said Mrs. Clem. "He'll sleep it off now. Tell me, sir," she looked up at Nicholas pleadingly, "did you really like the poem?" "I think it one of his very best." The anxious face brightened. "Would you help a little to get it published? I know you don't have anything to do with such things, but if you could just say a word here or there. Mrs. Gove heard it, and she said she'd try." "I shall be most happy to," answered Nicholas, and they left Mrs. Clem to the tending of her 2 sick children. That evening, when Miranda and Nicholas sat down to late supper in their cool dining-room, she summoned the courage to ask him the question which had been in the back of her mind all the long drive home. "Was the visit what you expected, Nicholas? Are you glad we went?" He put down his coffee cup and frowned into space. "The man is worthless," he said contemptuously, "but I envy him his dreams." "His dreams?" she repeated, not understanding. Nicholas nodded, but he shut his mouth firmly and did not explain. The man Poe had disappointed him. Nicholas had hoped for a kindred spirit, one as unhampered by petty morality, or the conventional attitude toward evil, as Nicholas knew himself to be. Instead, he had found despicable weakness, a sick man clutching at his mother and crying out for anodyne, a man terrified by the thought of death. There had, however, been one rewarding moment during the conversation with Poe, who had unknowingly suggested an unusual avenue of escape into the mystical realms of power and increased consciousness. An avenue not to be compared with the muddy downhill path which liquor represented. Some day, thought Nicholas, perhaps I shall experiment. "Could you send the poor thing some money? Anonymously, of course," said Miranda, seeing that Nicholas was through with the subject. He shrugged and picked up his coffee cup. "The sooner the wife dies, the better for everyone, I should think. But I'll have Bronk send them something if you wish." She was as anxious as he to forget the Poe household, and she soon did forget it. But as it was with Nicholas, one legacy from the visit remained with her. Hers was the memory of the unexpected pleasure she had felt in that dismal little kitchen at talking about Jeff. And the doctor had disturbed her. Though she did not think of Jeff very often, she nevertheless took to reading the war news. And whenever the casualty lists were published, she scanned them anxiously, reaching the bottom name with deep relief. Chapter 15. By the middle of June, the heat had settled into a succession of broiling days and muggy nights. Everyone who could left the city, and the Van Ryns with them. On a Thursday morning, Nicholas and Miranda boarded the Reindeer and started up the Hudson. They were to disembark at Catskill Landing and proceed 12 miles by stage to the Pine Orchard Mountain House. Miranda had hoped that as long as Dragonwick was not as yet ready, Nicholas might take her traveling. During the past fortnight, they had gone to parties given by the Schermerhorns and the Astors, where Miranda had met many people with more ambitious summer plans than theirs. Some were going to the ocean at Rockaway Beach, some to the White Mountains. 2 couples were even going as far afield as Niagara Falls and Lake Erie. "How I should love to see the real ocean. I never have, you know. Or Niagara Falls, Nicholas," she had said wistfully, but he would not consider any change of plan. He had had his fill of traveling during the year of their separation, and besides, he wished to be in the vicinity of Dragonwyck so that he could be present on the July rent day and oversee the opening of the house. "We might go up to Saratoga for a few days if we tire of the mountain house," he said, and that was the end of the matter. "I suppose I was greedy and ungrateful to want more," she thought, leaning against the Reindeer's mahogany rail and watching the Palisades slide by. How strangely different this was from her first trip up the river. The boat looked much the same as the one on which she had sailed then, but the Swallow, the graceful Swallow, with its name bird so bravely painted in blue on the wheelbox, was now nothing but a mass of rotting timber at the bottom of the Hudson. The Swallow had raced the Express once too often, and the year before had split herself in two on the rocks of a tiny island called Noah's Brig. 12 people had been drowned. "I wonder," thought Miranda, "if I had a premonition that day when the racing frightened me so." By turning her head, she could see a corner of the deck almost identical with the recess on the Swallow where Nicholas had placed her on that other June day 2 years ago. A shabby figure in brown merino, clutching the farm basket and wearing that hideous cheap bonnet. How dazzled she had been by the boat's carvings and archways, chandeliers, red plush carpets, and statuary. The Reindeer was even more elaborate, but now Miranda was accustomed to magnificence. "How I've changed," she thought. But beneath the surface pride of that thought was disquiet. She had her heart's desires, everything that the Miranda of 2 years ago would have considered a paradise: wealth, position, and Nicholas. Why, then, should she suddenly remember a Spanish saying that she had read long ago in The Gypsy's Revenge, one of those idiotic books she used to borrow from Debbie Wilson? "May all your wishes come true, and may they all curse you." "I don't know what's the matter with me," she thought impatiently, and turned from the rail as Nicholas approached. "Come to dinner, my dear one," he said gaily, drawing her arm through his. "The captain is waiting for us in his cabin." He was enjoying the trip. He had a deep feeling for the stately river which flowed by his manor, and though he shared little else with most of mankind, he shared that feeling of holiday freedom which a boat ride gives. In the deserted passageway before the captain's cabin, he bent down and kissed her. It was the type of tender kiss that any newlywed husband might give his cherished bride. She entered the cabin glowing and happy. The happiness lasted through the bustle of landing and the tedious ride in the stage up the mountains to the hotel.